we're here to celebrate his 90th birthday. Joe Sinnott is a legend. 90th birthday, helped craft the Marvel Universe, shaped it. Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, the titans of the Marvel Universe, and Joe Sinnott, who I swear to God, I see your inks over anywhere. I'm like, Joe Sinnott's inking them. John Byrne, who had really, who still does, has a really distinctive style. I saw your fingerprints all over it, and it excited me when you were doing Fantastic Four over his pencil. So, what can I say? You deserve every amount of the accolades that you get, and congratulations, you were awarded military honors.
Yep.
That's fantastic. You deserve every one of them. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce everyone up here on this panel. This is Jim Turnus, Joe St. Pierre, Ian Nichols, and Joe's grandson, Dorian Sinnott. That's fantastic. I just want to lead a round of applause to Joe Sinnott and his 90th birthday and the contribution that he has given all of us. Fantastic Four, one of the most legendary runs. You were one of the biggest parts, and in my opinion, one of the most memorable. So thank you so much. There we go, yeah.
I have to say my personal experience with Joe comes at a very, very young age when I read Fantastic Four, Thor. He was a regular on a lot of the Marvel covers. When I was about 12 or 13, I bought a book to learn how to draw comics the Marvel way. Does anybody remember that one? And it was a very good book. It was great for me. But the one thing that I got out of it, especially in particular, which I take to me to this day, is there's a chapter on inking. And it was like, it wasn't just how to express yourself as a superhero the Marvel way, instead of holding a pen like this, you hold a pen like this. It wasn't about that exaggeration. For me, that book was about how to interpret art with black lines and black shapes. And I take that chapter to me to this day. From that point on, I used to take my FF comics and I would open up say issue 68 with the awesome android fighting the thing, and I would literally just kind of squint my eyes and I learned about black placement, how not only the line work, but where a black shape is placed within the panel helps you to kind of read the action of the panel and also direct you to the next panel. So there is a hidden genius that's happening below the surface of the reading experience. And this guy is the best in the business at that kind of hidden genius, that kind of design eye, that kind of just skill with the hand. He's an expert in the field. I consider this guy a giant in the field. So happy birthday to Joe Sinnott. And inspired the hell out of him. And that's all I got. See you later.
Very good, Joe.
Maybe we could start with questions that I always wanted to know. Were you always an artist as a young child?
Yes, I can remember drawing when I was 3 years old. And of course, things were a little tough in the 1930s. Of course, we all know Prohibition, and the Depression was in full swing, and it was tough to even come across papers to draw on. I used to draw, I can remember drawing on paper bags that my mother would maybe get from the grocery, but I drew on everything. We had an old barn outside our house. We lived on a small farm. And I used to draw on the wood, the doors. I left my mark all over the place. But I constantly drew, even in school. Some of the teachers, they certainly didn't approve of me drawing on the books, but it was so nice to with a pencil, pencil very well. I can remember some of my books, and of course, that was a no-no.
The textbooks, you mean?
And I wish I had some of those drawings today. My earliest drawings go back. I drew, like I said, all my life. My father was a pack house foreman at a cement plant, and he had his own little office, and he used to take all my drawings that I did at home, and he would staple them on the walls of his little office. And of course, down through the years, the cement dust from the pack house, it infiltrated into the little office there, and I'm sure, well, I know it did. It ruined all my little drawings, and I wish he had kept them, put them in a book instead of stapled them in his office, but he was proud of them. And there wasn't a time that I didn't draw, and anytime someone needed a sign or something, they thought that, hey, Joe Sinnott, he's an artist, he can do this. But as we all know, artists can only do certain things, and they can't do everything. But I remember in World War II, I was 14, and a fella came up to the barn one day, up to the farm, I should say, and he had an old beat-up truck, and he had a, the military, well, you wouldn't call it a sign. It was an honor roll that he would paint the names of those who went into service, those that either joined the service or were drafted. And he said to me, Joe, I hear you're a pretty good artist. He said, I'll give you $10 if you paint these names on the board. He said, I'm not up to it. And they say you can do it. So $10 in 1942 was a lot of money to a 14-year-old kid. So I said, oh no, I'll do it. So he gave me the honor roll office truck, set it up. I went in my father had a workshop, and I looked for some old paint, found an old paintbrush, and I started painting these names on the honor roll. I knew nothing about sign painting, and it wasn't easy, of course. And so anyway, when I got through, he had given me maybe about 10 names to paint on the board. So I felt really happy. I made $10 just for painting 10 names. First thing you know, the following week, his old truck comes, drove up the dirt road, and he said, Joe, I got some more names for you. And that continued all summer. Anytime the fellows were drafted or joined the service, he would come up with another list of names. So that summer, I worked all summer painting names on that honor roll, and for all I got was $10. So it wasn't a good deal after all. But so they put the honor roll up down by one of the churches in our local little town, and I was very proud of it. In fact, I even went overboard and I painted a Marine, a soldier, and a sailor up at the top because it had nothing. It just said Cement Honor Roll, World War II. And I felt it needed something, and I had to draw these characters. And it lasted for years. Even after the war, they didn't take it down. They should have taken it down and stored it. I would love to see it today, but it was one of the things I was proud of as a kid. And of course, going to high school, they wanted me to be the art editor for our yearbook and the paper. We had a paper called the Ulsterette, and I used to do drawings every time the paper come out, and I used to really loved waiting for the next edition because my mind was just full of drawings that I had to get out. And I can remember, you know, if it was Valentine's Day or Thanksgiving, I did all these drawings, and it was my first exposure and the first time I ever had things printed in a newspaper. And I still have some of those today. But working for the yearbook, I did all kinds of drawings. Every year we would have a theme. Like one year it would be maybe insects. And you know, we did animated insects in our drawings. And the next year it might be, see, we were from an area that you can say harvested or mined bluestone. All the curbs in New York City came out of Saugerties because we had an unusual stone. It was limestone actually, but they called it bluestone, and it didn't get slippery when it got wet. That was the one thing that was good about it. So all the curbs in New York City came out of Saugerties over the years. And then in the wintertime, we harvested ice along the Hudson. And we had ice houses all along our area. And all the ice was shipped to New York City for the restaurants and saloons and everything. And so in other words,
are you an ice carver too? You carve ice too? Are you an ice carver too?
He doesn't sculpt.
You're not a sculptor?
Okay.
So what year, see, our theme for the yearbook would be the bluestone industry. And all the art staff, you know, they had, of course, the editor, and then we had his staff, my staff, for example. And we did drawings pertaining to the bluestone industry. And the next year it might be the harvesting of ice on the Hudson. So we always had a theme, like I said, and I certainly loved high school, and I loved the art. The only trouble was we only had 2 classes of art. One was representation, and the other was design. And of course we drew bottles and flowers, and not things I wanted to do. I wanted to do figures. And I remember one year when I was a junior, the art teacher says, now for your last drawing of the year, you can do anything you want. And naturally, I could have drawn a bowl and maybe got an A or a B plus or whatever, but I had to do what I had to do. And I drew, at that time, it was November 1943, and the Marines were landing in Tarawa in the Pacific. And I drew the invasion of Tarawa, with all the Marines landing on the beaches with tanks. And
oh, wow.
I had to stay after class to finish it. And here again, that's another thing I wish I had that drawing today.
Ambitious. So you were ambitious from early
I
age.
certainly was.
Because you didn't want to draw just one soldier. You had
I'm
to draw.
talking here, no matter what I'm talking about, if any of you guys have a question, please ask. I was telling Joe a little while ago, I often go to schools and talk to the art classes. So one day I went to there were younger kids, 8, 9, 10 years old. So I said, all right, any of you guys got a question? I said, I'd like to start off my talk with a question and answer session. So the one kid raised his hand, and I said, yeah, are you? What's your question? He said, how much money do you make? That was pretty good. Anyway, you guys got any questions?
So, I wanted to ask you, your first comic book stuff, the first thing you did professionally in comics, was it with Stan?
No. I was going to the Cartoons Illustrator School in New York City. Vern Hogarth was the director. He drew Tarzan, like everyone knows. And my instructor, Tom Gill, thought my work, he liked my work, my style, and he had all kinds of accounts with Timely. That's a forerunner of Marvel Comics. And he had worked with Fawcett, Gell, a couple others. And he had one other student that worked with him in his little sun porch out in Rockville Center. So anyway, he asked me if I would like to be his assistant. I was on the GI Bill, just barely getting along, and he paid very well. He paid comparably to what guys were making in the field. So anyway, I told him, Tom, I'll be glad to work with you. So anyway, I was doing Ken Blake and Red Warrior. There were two characters that timely, Marvel, before they became Marvel, they were doing. So I worked with Tom for about 9 months and doing all the drawing except the heads. Tom wanted to draw the heads to make it look like his work. But then he came to a point where he let me do everything. So anyway, I got married in a pleasant time. And I said to my wife, Betty, I'm going to go over to that stand if you give me some work because I'm doing all of Tom Gill's work.
Wait, Joe, what was the series that you were working on doing bodies,
It
except?
was mainly Ken Blake.
Oh, that was the name of the
He
series?
was an
Blake.
FBI
Oh,
agent.
okay. Thank you.
And of course, that was the days before superheroes.
Mhm.
And the big thing in comics were westerns, science fiction, FBI stories, and whatever. So anyway, I went over to Stan, and Stan said, I thought, somebody was doing Tom's work. He said, but I'll give you a little script and see what you can do with it. So he gave me a western story, and 3 pages, it was called, I'll never forget it, The Man Who Wouldn't Die. And naturally, I put everything I had into it. It took me about a week to do it. And, which was a long time for a 3-page story. So I wrote it back, Stan liked it. So he gave me another script. And that was 66 years ago. And I'm still with Stan. I've been doing Spider-Man, the Sunday page. I've been inking the Sunday page over Alex Saviak's pencils. I've been doing the inking, and I've been doing that for 27 years. I retired in 1991 from Marvel. I called up Stan, and I said, Stan, I'm just burnt out, and I really was. I was working hard. I never took a vacation, and I had so many books, The Fantastic Four, Thor. I was doing so many covers, and I was also, I had worked with other companies that I didn't want to give up because, to make a long story short, we went belly up in 1959. So I told Stan, I said, I'm not going to put all my eggs in one basket. I'm going to do the other jobs I have that Dell wanted me to work for them, Treasure Chest, and I had a couple others that Charlton wanted me to do. I did 2,700 pages for Vince Coletta. I penciled them, and Vince Coletta inked them, and I would do these pages. It's hard to believe. I would do the Marvel pages during the day until supper time. I'd have supper, and I'd go up and I'd work for about an hour penciling these romance pages. And Mark, my son here, he was doing an index of all my work. I kept a record of everything I ever did. If I got $5 for it, I would write it down. So Mark, he was doing an index of anything I ever did. And he said to me, Dad, do you know how many pages you penciled for Vince Coletta for Charlton? And I thought back, well, I did these pages at night after supper. And I said, gee, I must have did 500. It seems like a lot. He said, you did 2,700 pages, And of course, romance was easy to do. And of course, I wish I could have inked some of the pages because, Vince, he was
Especially the Gorgo stories.
pardon me?
Especially the Gorgo stories.
Gorgo.
Yeah, I did Gorgo also for Charlton. And in fact, Charlton was making a movie now on all the strips that they did over the years, and they're making a movie, sort of a documentary on all the artists that worked for them. And of course, I only worked for them for a couple of years doing those romance stories, but they wanted me included, so they came up and they they interviewed me, and it's going to be a lot of fun. It'll be out next year, right, Mark? So, come on, I got to ask a question or two because,
2,000 pages in a couple of years.
yeah.
In 2 years, you did 2,000 pages.
Oh.
So that's like,
And you did the Beatles
And not
book.
only that, after supper, my wife didn't drive. I was the only one that drove. I had 4 kids, and I coached Little League baseball, basketball. I was in the Cub Scouts, the Boy Scouts, and I had to bring my kids to these meetings at night. I don't know how I ever did all the work I ever did. Even for Marvel, I did thousands of pages for Marvel. And treasure chest. The other companies like Treasure Chest, I did all my pencils and inks. I did everything. I did everything for Dell. I did the Life of the Beatles, 64 pages, pencils and inks. So through the 60s and 70s and 80s, I tell you, and I also did, as a freelance artist, you didn't want to turn anything down because you didn't know what was around the corner. And I used to do billboards. I did brochures for local advertising agencies. And I just did everything you could possibly think of. And of course, Mark, he was a little kid. And Mark's 56 now, 55. And he had his own little table up. I had a studio covered my whole upstairs. And Mark had a table just like mine. He wanted to be a cartoonist, but at the time, it was a tough field to enter. We had no benefits.
Mark, you got smart and you got out. Well done.
You got out, right?
But now, of course, Mark, he went into the post office and now he'll get a pension and he'll retire before I do.
I'll use a cane before you too.
Because you worked at Marvel when they started the changeover from like the monster books and westerns to the superheroes.
Dennis said when you worked.
So you worked on the early fours. Were you surprised when
They changed to the
started to come
superheroes?
back?
Were you surprised when you went to the Thors instead of the monster
Now,
books?
1961. From 59, when we almost went belly up, we did for 6 months. Nobody had any work. Marvel had a lot of inventory that they could use. So Martin Goodman, the publisher, told Stan, don't buy any more artwork, use up what you have. So Stan used up everything he had in inventory, and when he was finished, Martin Goodman said to Stan, now, why don't you dig up some of the old Captain Americas that we did back in the 1940s, and because he didn't want to buy any new art, he didn't have the money. We were really up against it, and so when the sales reports came in about 3 months later, they were all surprised that these superheroes sold well. You know, the Human Torch and Captain America especially. So Martin Goodman said to Stan, why don't you create some new characters? Now this was 1961. So he created the Fantastic Four. We did them, I'm ahead of myself. We did them after we went belly up. Stan tried monster books. And they were fairly successful. They were a lot of fun. They were short stories, 5 and 6 pages long. And for the artists, they were a lot of fun. And but then, anyway, in 61, when Stan did the Fantastic Four, that was in November. And soon after that, he did, the Mighty Thor. Spider-Man came a little bit later, maybe 6 months later, in 62. And of course, that's when the superheroes took off. And it was amazing, all through the early 60s, 70s, 80s. I mean, we had so much work. That's why Roy Thomas and other people, they went overseas and they got the Filipino artists and other people to help out with the workload at Marvel. We had 64 books at one time, a month. That was unbelievable. But Stan figured at that time, I remember when I first started working with Jack Kirby, Jack Kirby was not an inker. And Stan said, he called me up and said, Joe, I'm having trouble finding someone to ink Jack Kirby. Could you squeeze it in your schedule? So I did a Kirby book, and Stan liked it so much, he liked the combination. He wanted me to stay with Jack Kirby, which I did. He made it worthwhile for me to do this financially. And Marvel, when I say Marvel, they were the only ones that I inked for. I had other accounts, Treasure Chest, Dell, for Charlotte, and I did the pencils for those companies. The inking also with Treasure Chest. They used to give me all the biographical stories. I did the life of MacArthur and Eisenhower, John Kennedy, Babe Ruth, because I did fairly good likenesses. And Treasure Chest, they paid me more than Marvel did. But I loved the Marvel characters, but I couldn't leave Treasure Chest because I was getting more satisfaction out of doing these type of stories. And of course, Treasure Chest liked what I was doing. And Dell wanted me to stay with him after I did the Beetle book. But I just had too much of a workload. And those early 60s were unbelievable because, like I said, I didn't turn anything down. Someone called me. I used to do drawings for Price the Chopper. It's a big grocery chain in upstate New York. And I used to do all their drawings. I created a character where he has a little hatchet and he's chopping prices all the time, you know. So anyway, like I said, I wouldn't turn down any kind of offer for my services. And but like I said, I don't know how I did everything. You got a question, Mark?
Yeah, tell them about the Beetle book. A lot of people may not know the story of the Beetle book, when you did it, how many pages.
I was 1964, and I never heard of the Beatles. And I got a call from Dell Comics, and they said, Joe, my good friend, Vic Prezio, I never forget the name, he was an illustrator, and he said, we were looking for someone to do the life of the Beatles. They're coming over to America. They're new in the music field, but we think they're going to be very big, and we want a book out before they get on Ed Sullivan's show. And Vic Prezio said, you do good likenesses. I don't know where he saw my work, but he recommended me. That's how you get a lot of work in comics. You're recommended by someone else that likes your work.
Had you heard of the Beatles before?
Pardon?
Had you heard the Beatles music?
I had never heard of the Beatles, you know.
They just handed you a job with the greatest rock band ever, and you said, okay, I'll take it.
Whose pencils did you find easiest to ink and who's the most difficult, and why?
Oh boy, there were a lot of difficult ones, I'm telling you. Of course, Kirby was the easiest to ink. I mean, because he was a pure cartoonist. John Buscema was an illustrator, and John Buscema was the best draftsman in comics, no question about it. We had some good ones. John Romita was good, Gene Colan. I had some favorites. But Kirby, even though he put so much into his work, his machinery was unbelievable, but you had to give him everything that he gave you, you know. And so Kirby was a lot of fun. And there isn't anything Kirby drew that I did. I never cut corners with anybody. And Kirby, I may have added a little bit here and there, a few blacks and whatever. But Buscema, the first thing I did with him was Silver Surfer. I did number 1, 2, and 3. And when I saw his work, I couldn't believe it. It was fully pencil tight, and number 3, I always thought was one of the best things that I ever did with John Buscema. But he wanted his brother Sal to ink him. Sal was a great inker also, and he wanted Stan fought with John. He said, John, he said, Joe, you were doing a great job. I like it. And John said, Stan, you know, John Buscema, he could throw his weight around. He had a lot to say. So Stan gave in and let Sal Buscema do the, what did he do, about 6 or 7 issues, Mark?
Yeah.
They were all great. And then he quit for some reason. That Dan Atkins came on, did a nice job. Poor Dan is gone now, but he did a great job on Dan was a very good friend of mine. So you can see it's amazing the reasons guys left books, and I remember one time they put me on they called me up and said, Joe, could you ink Gene Colan's Captain America? And I said, yeah, I always liked Gene. Gene was very hard to ink, but he had very fine lines. He had to be very careful, use a lot of pen, but he did beautiful layouts. So I did a Captain America with Gene, and Sal Brusca, he was the production manager at the time. He called me up, he said, Joe, he said, I had to call you and tell you what a great job you did on Gene Colan. Now, Marvel would never call you and tell you did a great job, because you're a professional. They figured you're supposed to do a good job. But I thought Sal was a good friend of mine. I thought he was pulling my leg, but he was sincere. And they were pretty good, weren't they, Mark? Captain America was there. You know, some of the best inking jobs that I did. And but I had a lot of guys I worked with I really loved, and but Buscema, we did some great Thors. He didn't like drawing Thor. He didn't like the Fantastic Four. He liked Tarzan and Conan. And but I can never say enough about. Of course, I stayed with Buscema a long time, but as the years progressed, I got less and less from John. But you didn't need much from him. He just gave me thumbnail sketches. That's all I needed, because basically I was a penciler myself for 15 years before I started inking just for Stan. So it was great work for John, even at that stage. And of course, we used to get the same credits, co-artists, Thor, the Fantastic Four, and I worked with some great guys, and I worked with some guys that were hard working with. But I turned down one story in 66 years with Stan, and I got a story. It was Chuck Norris, you know, the Kung Fu guy. That was penciled by Steve Ditko. Now, we all know Steve Ditko's a top of the line guy, much admired, but I don't know whether he had a tight schedule or what, but there was nothing but cylinders, you know. And at the time, I was doing some stuff with other guys, and like Stan, he mentioned earlier today, I don't know whether you heard Stan's speech down at the downstairs, but he said if a new book come out, a lot of the guys would say, Stan, see if you can get Joe Sinnott to ink it for me, you know. So anyway, I kept getting work. There was hardly anything there. I hate to criticize anybody's work in comic because it's all hard work, right, Joe?
I was just going to ask you, do you have a preference yourself? Do you like to work on tight pencils and then you bring yourself to that, or do you prefer the
It didn't matter.
Didn't matter? Like you said, for
I
me,
was doing a lot of pencils for Treasure Chest. Yes, Mark, I did so many stories for them. And they were hard stories. I mean, the life of MacArthur, and Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and Babe Ruth, and I did a lot of biblical, not biblical, but biographical stories. I did biblical also. I did stories on the popes.
If I could just clarify my question.
Yeah.
If I could. When you hit a pencil page, do you have a preference whether it's very tight and everything is there, or do you prefer, like, just like you said, John Buscema sometimes would give you gestures?
I prefer, you know, it to be a little loose. I don't like tight pencils where you're confined. You have to do, what they have there. I like it loose.
Can you talk about that relationship between a penciler and an inker? It's a team, right?
Oh yeah. Well, of course.
So you don't want everything given to you.
There's inkers, beautiful inkers. That's all they do is ink. They're really not pencilers. And there are guys like Frank Giacoya, who was a great penciler, but he was a great inker also. And I think I fell into that category. I always admired, and I always got satisfaction out of my pencils, because I did so many of them for so many companies and hard stories that for me to ink anybody's pencils, it was not difficult. Although, if a young guy came into the field, sometimes you had to pick them up quite a bit, and it took extra time, because I was always a stickler for detail, and I always wanted to give them 100%, and I never cut corners, so there were all kinds of pencilers, and if a penciler knew that you could pick them up, he would give you less the next time.
And you didn't like that.
Like Jim Steranko.
Yeah! Well, Jim was one of a kind. Yeah,
What was that like?
I started working with Jim when he was fairly young in the field, and he did some Captain Americas and Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. that they had to ink. And I'll tell you, we did some double-page spreads that I certainly didn't make any money on, but they come out real good. And of all the years I ever worked, I worked one Christmas, and it was over a Jim Steranko story.
Trying to meet a deadline.
Huh?
Yeah.
Trying to meet a deadline.
Trying to meet a deadline.
Not because
And
you're
another
really-
thing, yeah, 66 years I've been working, and I never missed a deadline, so.
That's
But I was always pretty
I don't
faithful.
believe that. I don't believe it for a second.
Kirby was easy. Kirby.
That's impossible.
Oh. No. It was
Never missed the deadline, not one. Not one.
really.
You
Oh, but see, a lot of the young guys coming into the field,
Here
they
we go.
do beautiful,
Let us have it.
beautiful work on the page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you get up around 12, 13, first thing you know, it's not as good as page 1, because they're running out of time, and the main thing about being a comic artist, you got to know how to pace yourself. If you get an 18 or 20 page story, you got to know how to pace it, make it look good all through the story. Don't put all your eggs in one basket and display it, and then you run out of steam towards the end, But that happens a lot with young artists, So, as an old geezer that's been inking for a long time, you did have to pick up a lot of young artists, and no question about it. But today I look at some of the artists that pencilers that I worked with years ago, and they do beautiful work. It's amazing. Rich Buckler's a good example. I used to have to do a lot of picking up with Rich. He did beautiful work today. Experience does that to you, Right, Joe?
Yeah.
The more you work, the better you get. That's one field that you keep improving is the comic field and the ability to be able to improve your drawing. Right, Jimmy?
People talk about the combination of Kirby and Stan, the run on Fantastic Four, is like this long Hallmark run. And Joe continued after they left for 120 some odd issues, and that's actually where I first saw Joe's incredible work. It wasn't on Kirby, it wasn't on Buscema or Buckler, it was Byrne and then Friends and these other great artists.
Oh,
that
so
he-
many.
George Perez.
Yeah, George Perez.
How many books did I do on the FF?
He's done either stories or covers over 200. His work is in over 200 issues that he has.
Yeah, 231 probably, right?
But you're right about that. But I always felt, even with Kirby, I remember when I first got the pages, I said, gee, Jack doesn't know how to draw ears. I'm going to give him now a training ear, So,
I saw those.
so
I saw those ears.
the more I
They're
wrote
awesome.
with Kirby, I said, I gotta go back to how Jack penciled it, but a lot of my stuff used to show up in the early FFs, you know? But it wasn't curvy. I mean, it was curvy, but it wasn't curvy. But Stan always said to me, Joe, whatever you're doing, keep doing. We like it, you know? I did. There were certain things, Jack, as great as he wasn't perfect. There were some things that he couldn't, well, he needed an editor to point out the things he was doing wrong. If Jack was drawing a headshot, which is very rare, but if he didn't, he couldn't put his two eyes on the same plane. He always had one above the other. He had to correct this, you know? But then again, here again, it's not curvy if you change those little things, you know? So, but I try to get away from changing curvy like I did early on, you know? But Jack was a wonder. Mark, did you have something?
No, I'm good right now.
Okay. Looks like you wanted to ask me a tough question.
All I can do is use tongue, but I'll let these guys guess.
Yeah.
I got questions.
No, I'm good.
Take a drink.
I'm
Take a
good.
drink.
Jimmy's watching me.
He didn't have a question.
Oh,
You worked with so many artists over the years, and you worked with them for long periods of time. Did you feel like you could work with them right away and have a good feel for it, or was it over time that you guys worked together?
I don't think I had ever had to worried about. If I got a new script like Gene Colan, for example, on Captain America. Of course, I knew Gene and I were the same age. But I remember years ago, I'm talking about 1950, 51, we used to go into, it was Timely then it became Atlas. We'd go in and sit down in a little waiting room, maybe 4 or 5 with Bob Powell and Sid Shores, and Stan's secretary would come out and say, okay, Gene, Stan will see you. And we'd go in with our story. Usually they were 5-page westerns, science fiction, war stories. And we'd give it to Stan, and he'd be sitting there with a pile of legal paper, the yellow paper, and he had his typewriter, always had his typewriter. And he'd look at the work and say, well, it looks pretty good, Joe. He'd put it aside, and he'd take a script right off the top of the pile he had. It could be a war story, it could be a romance, it could be anything. But as a professional, you were expected to be able to do it. He didn't say, what kind of a story do you want, Joe? He'd just give it to you. And usually 5 or 6 page stories, which were perfect back in the 50s, because I used to bring them, I used to come down to Marble on a Friday, every Friday. I'd bring the story home. I'd start on a Monday. I'd pencil a page in the morning, ink it in the afternoon, and by Thursday I was done with that 5 and 6 page story. Betty and I, my wife, we'd go down Friday. I'd drive all the way to the city. I'd park my car 238th Street, take the subway down. We were in the Empire State Building at that time. I'd bring the work in, he'd give me another script, I'd go home. It was a great system. These short stories, you never got bored. You'd have a Western one week, science fiction the next, a war story. So it was a lot of fun actually working in the 50s. And like I said, it fitted me perfectly because I did a page a day, pencil, and then inked the page, and I was done by Thursday, you know. So it was a great system.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was a great period of 30s, you know.
Were there any artists that you worked with that you thought were really great but didn't get the accolades of a Kirby, didn't become as famous?
There were a lot of good artists. You know who I like work? Well, of course, he was great. Did you ever hear of Fred Keaton?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah,
Oh, great artist. I love working with him. In fact, I've been doing the inking on the Spider-Man since 1991, and I started out with Ron Friends, and Ron and I think we do a pretty good job. I love the way Ron does covers. He's got a little bit of Buscema in him and a little bit of Kirby, but he gives you good work. And Ron and I are very good friends. He's a great artist. So Ron, he had some personal problems, so he left the Spider-Man strip, and then Sal Buscema took it over for a little bit, then Paul Ryan, then back to Sal Buscema, then Fred Keaton took it over. And Fred Keaton's an old time, when I say old time, he's even older than I am, you know? That's old. So anyway, when I was a kid, I used to like Fred Keaton's work when he did Airboy and The Heat, and he was just an all-around good illustrator. And so anyway, he came on the Spider-Man strip, and I loved working with him. And when I got to work, it would say Stan Lee, and that's all it would say, the credits. So I called Stan, I said, Stan, Fred Keaton's not signing it. I said, what's the matter? He said, Joe, he doesn't want anybody to know that he's doing Spider-Man. He doesn't want any fan mail. He doesn't want anybody to know what he's doing. So it used to be, for a while, about a year and a half, Stan Lee and Joe Sinnott. But I was just doing the inking. I wasn't doing the pencil. Fred Keaton. But Fred passed away about 2 years ago. But I never met him. But I loved his work right from the time I was 14 years old. And but then after, like I said, after Paul Ryan and Paul told me he was offered a job over DC, I think doing Supergirl, and he told me years later, of course, Paul was a great penciler. He passed away young age, about 2 years ago, I think. But in any case, he said, Joe, he said, I made a mistake giving up Spider-Man. He said, I loved it, but I thought I had a better future in DC. Well, he said that he did. But anyway, all these different artists, then Alex Saviak came on the strip about, I'm guessing, 17 years ago. And Alex does a great job. He does a great Spider-Man. And so he puts a lot into his work. He's one of those guys I always say doesn't believe in white space. George Perez was that way. When George first came into business, I got to do his work on the Fantastic Four or whatever. And I'll tell you, George was not easy to ink. He put everything but the kitchen sink in every panel. And I always believed that his wife was filling in the blacks. You know, as an inker, I do everything. I fill in the blacks, I do everything. Whereas George Perez, if he had a head, which was seldom, in the background, instead of leaving it white, he'd have a checkerboard. I had to fill all these blacks in, like it was not a chess game, but didn't think of their name. Checkers, a checker. And, but of course, George became a very good friend of mine, but he, hard work. I can remember George one time. It was he was in a park, and the guy and the girl were sitting at on the bench and talking, and he did a bird's eye view of the whole figures, them sitting on the bench, and instead of just sitting there, you're feeding the pigeons. He had about 100 pigeons all over the ground. So I had to draw all these pigeons. So the next panel, instead of changing the scene, having maybe a close-up, he had the same scene, all these pigeons going around, you know. So the first thing you do, you know, as an inker, when the story comes in, you look to see how hard it is, because, hey, you're in the business as a living. You're not in it to be a Picasso or Norman Rockwell, you know. So, for George was a lot of fun, but I'll tell you, he's that way today. A couple things I turned back. George, he loved to do what he called the posters, Mark. Remember the posters? And he had so many characters in there, you know. And you know, we're not paid by the characters, we're paid by a page read. At least I was, you know. And I'll tell you, it was never an easy life sometimes. Really.
I can keep asking questions, but if anybody else.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Maybe, I don't know if this has been covered before, sorry. Any non-comic influences, writers or films that got into your head when you were thinking of your art? Music, writers, film.
Thinking of your art, do you ever think of any like films or directors or movies or anything?
Music.
Oh,
Like
sure.
images?
Science fiction writers.
More so years ago when you did all kinds of stories, like if you were doing a Western. I mean, you would pattern your hearing after like Randolph Scott or someone. And I remember Gene Colan, as good as he was, he did some great, in the 50s I'm talking about now, he did some great war stories. And he always, as his hero, he always used William Holden. And Gene used a lot of the reference back in those days, but he was good at it. I mean, but no, when you're drawing a character, I used to watch John B. Sinnott. I used to sit next to him a lot of shows, and years ago things were different than they are today. You used to do the draw when you have a table like this with maybe 10, 15 artists. You know, John B. Sinnott, Dick Giordano, and Jeff Morrow, and not Jeff Morrow, but Gray Morrow, people like that. And we'd all be doing sketches for the fans. They would line up, and the sketches were free. We didn't charge in those days, you know. I don't know when it started. But anyway, Gene Colan, I was reading up to Gene Colan.
William Holden.
Reference.
William Holden. Randolph Scott. William Holden.
Oh, yeah. And, John B. Simmons, I used to watch him when he drew. John's characters were like himself. I mean, he had a hero's face. He looked like Michelangelo with the flared nostrils, and when he drew a character, he was drawing himself, you know? He had these nostrils, you know, and I was watching him, and he'd be grimacing as he's drawing. I think he's copying his face.
Acting out.
But you often do that. If you watch an artist draw, you know, he said, if he's drawing a serious scene, you know, you'll do that, right, Joe? You know, you just, but anyway, you're right, Mark. Randolph Scott or John Wayne, and then if you were doing a swashbuckler, actually Earl Flynn. Gray Morrow used to like, who do you call it? Alex Toad. He loved Earl Flynn. A lot of his characters, they looked like Earl Flynn.
Sure.
And he probably used some reference there too. But yeah, you always thought of the character when you're drawing a character. You know, makes it easier for you. You know, it's like if you had a picture of them in front of you. So when you're drawing without reference, naturally, you're thinking of Earl Flynn or whatever. You know.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Did you yourself were you a comics fan or a science fiction fan or a movie fan? Did you have favorite authors, or did you ever read the comics themselves?
Oh, of course, as a kid, that's all you did.
What were you reading?
I was 12 years old in 1938 when comics really burst on the scene. And of course, we used to buy them 10 cents, as you all know. And of course, they never kept. You pass them on to your buddy next door. And you know, by the time they got through going around the neighborhood, there was nothing left to them. I know. I must have had Action Comics #1, or if I didn't, my buddy had it. And we just never thought much of the value of things back in those days, you know. And but as far as writers in the early days, they didn't get credit. It was the artists that got all the credit, and they just never put their names on anything, you know. Of course, we as artists, we knew, like for Timely or Marvel, we knew Ed George and people like that did these stories. But it wasn't until the superheroes came along that they started giving credit to the writers, you know. And but before that, it was just a job. You didn't care. Just as long as you made a paycheck. And after one story was done, you forgot all about it. If someone came up to you and said, Joe, well, the last story you did was really good. And you'd say, well, what was that? Well, what did I do? Because it was your job, and you did so much, you forgot what you did, really. So you didn't pay attention to the office. In fact, I hate to admit it, but I seldom read the Fantastic Four. Of course, I get the pages from Jack Kirby, and Jack was one of the guys that I got the pages in sequence. If I was doing someone else, perhaps, I'd get pages 8 to 13. They were all mixed up. You never knew what was going on. You couldn't read the story. You couldn't follow it. Sometimes you didn't know if the writer, if the character were supposed to have a smile on his face or not. It was very hard for the inker a lot of times. He had a guess as to what was going on, really. You know, amazing. Come on.
Like when you were on Fantastic Four and they changed over artists, did you ever feel like, well, hey, I could do the pencils instead of the inking?
Yeah, I feel like you should have been doing pencils instead of some of the changeover artists.
Because, not really, because it was a job. In other words, we were making a living. It's just like we were working in wall bombs or Walmarts, you know. Of course, you look at the artwork today, you're proud of some of the stuff you did, you know. I always tried to do the best I could, no matter who I was working with. And like Mark can tell you, we often look at the old originals that we had. And I feel proud of some of the stuff that I've done. I'd say, gee, I had a good brush when I did that story. You could almost tell when you had a good brush. I used to do a lot of work with a brush, especially on Jack Kirby's work. And I often tell the kids, and I used to talk a lot to the schools, and I say, you know, the first thing, make sure you buy the best paper you can afford and the best pens and brushes, because the better equipment you have, the better job you can do.